Hi guys, so here we're going to continue on. This is basically the last PowerPoint. It's a little bit long, depending on how long it takes. I might split it in half for today and then for Friday, and then basically we're finished with the content. There's a couple more things we're going to do before the end of the semester, but make sure that you're doing your quizzes and that you're listening to the PowerPoints. So we stopped here. We started the era of modern art, which I mentioned before, starts right around 1860 or so, and it goes for about 100 years. Now we stop with Art Nouveau, and then as we continue forward now into the 20th century, we're going to start seeing a lot more changes in art. Some of the changes that a lot of people don't quite understand or are not a big fan of, or really don't want to pay attention to in order to understand it more like anything. So when we get into the 20th century, one of the biggest changes that are happening, or one of the conversations that are happening, are conversations, as I just mentioned, of change, of looking at art and seeing what the potentiality of art is. Really looking at art from a very pragmatic point of view. What is it? What is art? And we already had discussed this at the beginning of the semester, what art is. But this is a time that there is a complete awakening. Now, this awakening started with Manet, right? With just looking at what the principles of the elements of art are as elements of art, and that's it. But towards this kind of beginning of the 20th century, there's a group of artists that are really pushing the boundaries, especially the Fauvists. The Fauvists, it's a name, it's a word that derives from the word fauve, which is means a rebel of sorts in French. So those individuals who were rebels, those individuals who were pushing the boundaries of what art is, those individuals got a name of avant-garde. So the avant-garde were those who were in the front lines of this new world, basically, right? So avant-garde is a military term in French, which basically means the soldiers that are the front lines, right? So that's where avant-garde comes from. Now, you guys have heard this term contemporarily, and we use it for music, like avant-garde music or fashion, avant-garde fashion. But the ones who originally got labeled this way were the visual artists. So who were the avant-garde right here in the 20th century? The avant-garde, including the Fauves, are this kind of artists that really were taking things to its limit. And one of them is going to be Matisse. Matisse, you probably heard quite a bit. But what is Matisse doing? What is he pushing? What are the elements that he's trying to accomplish with this modernism? So as you look at this painting, there's a few things that are fairly obvious. The first thing is that you can see, hopefully, is that there is, the pattern on this cloth per se, it's basically the same pattern as the wall, almost as a complete single background, right? However, there's something very, very simple that really breaks down this information for us visually into clarifying in some ways the world that we recognize in reality, and that is just one single line. So this line right here, separating basically the background to this object right here, right, automatically gives us a sense of tablecloth or table versus wall. And the only thing that exists there is that one simple line. Now, all the things that we're seeing here and that we can recognize fairly quickly, it's going to be chair, we're going to see fruit, we see flowers, we see a female figure, we even see what she's doing. She's probably putting a table or taking down a table. All the things that we can see is that we have two bottles of wine, simple enough. There's a red and there's a red and there's a white. And there we have here a window. Now, so people see a painting. Some other people see a window, but it's actually a window. So anyway, so this is what we have. Now, the question that Matisse and his artists of the avant-garde are kind of questioning is, would I have to render this to complete details? Do I have to make sure that she is perfectly drawn and detailed in all of those elements. The same thing as the fruit and the wine and everything, in order for you to understand that there's a female figure here either taking down or putting down or organizing a table. Do you have to have all those details? Obviously you don't, right? We have all this information here. We don't need all of that, right? In order to convey a content, whether convey a story, convey a subject, convey whatever it is. Art does not require the duplication of reality through the visual means in order to communicate. That is the biggest thing of the modern art movement. How simple can you convey that idea? How simple can you utilize an object, a material, or the things that you're using and the elements and principles to design to convey something as clearly as possible, but at the same time with a sense of um, not clarity, but kind of creativity is the right word, right? Being creative on how you utilize the materials to say something new. So that is what Henri Matisse and a lot of these artists from the 20th century are doing. Right? Here's another artwork by Matisse, right? He's using, color here to differentiate values, not just the values themselves, but the color. He is using different senses of line and color and texture and all of those things. Now, I want you to look at this composition and start thinking that, or looking at it and see if there's some similarities from something we've seen before. Are there anything that looks similar? And if you think about it, this composition is a composition we've seen before, right? This is Manet's, and this is Matisse, right? Similar composition between this one and that one. So remember what Matisse was talking about at this time. Manet was talking about at this point, right? He was trying just to look at the elements of design and what they can do. So it's here. So it's Matisse. Matisse is not really trying to create this beautiful painting per se, but rather trying to do the same thing that Manet was doing, right? In order to kind of research, reinterpret, create something different, right? Just kind of see what the possibilities are, right? So this is one of those times that it's important to understand the connectivity of art through history, because a painting like this one it's relevant because of the past, right? So as you go through, through life and you're looking at art, you have to understand, as we mentioned before, there are a lot of the conversations that exist in art sometimes are between art and art, not always directed from art to viewer. Now, the viewer is always a part of it, obviously, but the more sophisticated you are with how you are the viewer, the more you're going to get from the paintings. All right, so let's move forward. Here's a few other expressionist artists, right? Artists who use color in a arbitrary form, artists who look at the index of color, the way warm and cool colors make you feel, and then apply those to emphasize, de-emphasize, change how you see the subject matter. Here's a German one. So, Andrea Derain. And here's a female artist also from the same time period. Excellent. Now, this gets us to Kandinsky. So Kandinsky, it's part of this conversation. He's part of this Fauve movement of these avant-garde individuals who are pushing the boundaries. And he's using color for color's sake. He's really using color because of what I just mentioned, the index of it, the intensity of it, all of those elements. The subject matter is treated very loosely, just basically as a place setter for color. So one of the things, part of history that's discussed is that at some point, let me see if I have it here on the screen, there he goes. He placed this object upside down, right? He puts the painting upside down. And then one of the things that we realize when putting this painting upside down is that the color still conveyed the same feelings, the same um, intensity, all of those elements. The color did not care whether it is placed in the shape of a horse or a figure or a tree or anything like that, right? Color can survive by itself, just without any boundaries of a subject. So as he continued to move forward, the subject was no longer relevant, and therefore we have this, right? So this is the moment of complete devolution of the figure, of the shape, of the, not the shape, of the form, right? So here we don't have any reminiscences whatsoever of the real world, if you may. Now there might be some elements that have been deconstructed, but overall this is all about color. Now, one of the things that Kandinsky is looking at and kind of following through is some of the things that Van Gogh was talking about, right? Color can be used arbitrarily, but also some of the things that Gauguin was talking about. The importance of how color would be within art, almost like music. So if you look at music, just like the exercise we did, if you look at music just through the eyes of notes, and painting with notes, but in this case painting with color to get a feel, a sense, a concept, not an image, right? Then all of a sudden, this is what you get, right? Just like your doodles from that one class period, right? This right now is what you get at the other end. So a lot of these paintings become known as Untitled, for example. You see a lot of that in the New World, but this one specifically is called Composition 4, right? Just like you have with music, you have a lot of the big music pieces from classical music. They're called composition this, composition that, and so forth and so on. There's not really a label that can describe what is in there, right? I mean, would you call a composition flower, right? Well, even if it's flower and you have the ideas of flower in your head while you're listening to the music has really nothing to do with flower, right? Unless you're a scientist and you're trying to get sounds from the flower somehow. But anyways, I digress. So what I'm saying is that in this case, artists, visual artists, and Kandinsky, and specifically in this time period, was using music as the way to convey the equalness of color, line, texture to music notes. You can recreate them, you can reorganize them. At the end is the feel, what you get out of it, versus what it actually, versus an object or a shape or a form, right? Now, be mindful of this, that when you go to an art gallery or looking at artwork, you have to understand what the artist is trying to accomplish for each one of these periods, or for their own body of work. Why? Because I cannot go with this idea of looking how this makes me feel and understand color here if I'm looking at a Renaissance painting. That's a completely different way of approaching and understanding and appreciating the artwork. If I'm looking at a Kandinsky, I'm looking at how it makes me feel, the artwork is conveying color, how it has been simplified, the forms, all of these things in abstraction, the simplification of this through a composition versus something that is classical on regards to, like, let's say, the Renaissance or the Baroque. Completely different approaches. All right, so I had mentioned before, we went through basically the deconstruction of the shape and the form through modernism through the eyes of the expressionists, those who use color arbitrarily in order to convey ideas through a sense of emotion or the index of color. Formalists are different. Now we're going to go see the same deconstruction of the figure and the form through the eyes of the formalists. Now the formalists are much more attached to the material, as art for art's sake in some ways as well, right? So they're looking at material. at what paint is, at what cardboard is, and how to reconstruct that material so you can see the possibilities of the material itself, and maybe convey something with it. So the first one that's looking at material in some ways, but also the way we use paint, right, is Seurat. So Seurat, as we mentioned before, well, let me backtrack a little bit. So before we had mentioned that, in this time period, we understand light slightly different, right? We're understanding how light works, and light is basically one single, um, uh, not ray, yeah, let's call it a ray of light, right, which is completely white. And then once it goes through an object or an object, it breaks into different colors, right? So it disperses the colors, the photons. All of them are different. So our eyes collect those photons and then recolor depending on how much or how little of that white ray is remaining, right? So at the end, what we have in our eyes specifically is we have all these little cells, basically like dots, and then every single one of those photons, colors remaining, are going to also be some one of dots. So Rod in some ways are thinking, well, the way we see is through a set of dots that are combined together with our eyes, and our brain just kind of unifies all those dots together into the array of colors that we see. So what if we do the same thing with paint, right? Instead of mixing paint together, what if we keep it divided? What if we just do one specifically the dot of color next to another color, dot of color, and so forth and so on, so it gives the sense of the mixture of the color rather than mixing the color itself? Because the reality is that that's what happens in reality, right? Colors, the light bounces off an object. Some of the photons are absorbed by the object, the other ones bounce out. Our eyes basically catches those photons, the remaining colors, and then it reads the color. So same thing with paint, right? So this is what Seurat's painting looked like very much at close. So we have all those little tiny dots of color, right? This division of the color rather than the mixture of the color. So this right here originally was called divisionism. Divisionism, because we divide the colors, you keep them separated. We don't mix them, right? We normally mix colors in paintings. In here, we keep them divided. Now, eventually, we also call it pointillism, right? And we also know right now that pointillism is not the same as stippling, right? Stippling is adding value with dots. Pointillism is painting with dots of color. And ideally, I would love for you guys to remember it more as divisionism rather than pointillism. But for the sake of, social ease, pointillism is what this is called. So I just mentioned before, it's just an optical illusion of color mixture. Now, other artists were looking at color similarly in our eyes and the formal way in which we read color. Now, Seurat was looking at the micro, right? He was paying attention to the molecules, to the photons, to the tiny little particles. Here we have somebody that's looking at the bigger picture, and that's Cézanne. Cézanne is thinking more in a much larger format. If you're looking at the distance, right? If you're looking at a field, right? At the field, all the way in the back, you cannot see every single detail, right? You can't really see everything. Now, your brain's telling you that there's trees and there's animals and there's all this detail that we know exists there. However, the reality is that we don't. We see just flat areas of color. And some of them are much more darker and lighter, but nevertheless, they're just flat areas of color, right? Cézanne understood that, and he basically did that. Instead of he painting the detail by mixing it, what he would do is just basically paint, areas of flat color, right? Really large areas of color. So here is, all these elements. Now, can you still read the mountain? Can you still read the sky, and then the forest, and even, a little village of sorts here? Now, do you need to know all the detail from this landscape? No, no. The only thing you're trying to convey with this is that there was a mountain, or there is a mountain in this painting, there is a village in this painting, there is a green landscape, and so forth and so on. I love doing this because once you do this, you can start seeing, the complete abstraction that we eventually going to get to here through the formalist. Now, if you're looking at this, right, Cezanne, eventually, as I mentioned before, all these artists were very good friends, or were contemporaries, and there was all of the ideas were discussed among themselves, right? There's a really cool relationship here of, information kind of being shared between these two artists, right? Can you see the similarities basically between this very simplistic, a house and then this other house too? Same thing as kind of the simplification of, the sense of space here through, once again, flat colors. Same thing here, right? Now, this one's pretty loose. This one's a lot more rigid. This is starting to look very geometric. This is very loose, but this is a lot more geometric, right? We start seeing boxes. Now, what kind of art do we recognize that has cubes or boxes? Cubism, right? So cubism comes from this sense of looking at the subject matter through a sense of flatness of color, or the flatness of what we see in the distance, right? So this simplification of color or form in general. Now, when we think of Cubism, automatically most of us think Picasso. Well, not quite. This is Braque. So Georges Braque is one of those, along with Picasso, who were working side by side, hand by hand, finding, creating, and evolving what Cubism was. Braque and Picasso were really, really, really good friends, and their artwork in many parts of Cubism looks almost identical. If you were to go to a show of Braque paintings with Picasso paintings, it's really hard to see the difference. Now, if you were an expert, you can know exactly what you're looking for. But generalistically speaking, they are very, very similar because they were trying to together in some ways follow through with this experimentation of taking the world, the subject matter, and simplifying it through, flat surfaces. And that obviously gets us to Picasso. So we consider Picasso a genius, and what is the genius before, that Picasso is, and why is it that we hear more about Picasso than we do Braque? If Braque was also a cubist at the same time period, and they were friends, right? Picasso always pushed the boundaries just to the next level. He's definitely an avant-garde. He really kind of took elements a step further. One of his most iconic paintings is this one right here, which is the Mademoiselle d'Avignon. And in these paintings, there's several elements that are connected to modernism. One of the things that is really interesting here, beyond just kind of the subject matter and being participant of or recognizing kind of these females, which are unfortunately prostitutes, right? And I say unfortunately just because of the subject matter of what you guys have seen, but in general, one of the things that's important is to see the relationship to the past. So like the simplification of the background is very much like Cezanne. But obviously the one thing that is very odd about this painting is that all the heads in this painting are done differently. So it becomes really uneasy. Why is it that way, right? Now, why is it uneasy? Well, in the past we talked about unity, right? We talked about how unity is important in an artwork for it to be pleasing, aesthetically interesting, right? So in this case, he's really switching unity around and giving us variety instead of unity, which becomes, once again, very uneasy, disruptive, right? All the heads are different. Now, they're different, but they're also odd, right? This one is disjointed, this one is flat, and so forth and so on. All of these heads are really weird. So was he weird to try to be weird, or was he just trying to dislocate the heads? What is the full point of the whole reason for doing this? Well, as we saw with Van Gogh and with Cassatt, artists were looking outside of the Western world for inspiration on history, on how to look at beauty, right? So we always see beauty through the eyes of the Greeks and through the Romans and even through the Egyptians. But what about beyond that connection? Since artists right now were anti the School of Fine Arts, right? We didn't want to go back into Greek and Roman. So where were these artists looking at? So Picasso traveled quite a bit, and he was paying attention how our ancient cultures were describing the subject matter, the figure, the male, the face, right? How were very ancient cultures describing all of those elements? Not just much the Greeks, but Polynesian, African, Asian, etc. How these cultures defined it. So one of the best examples that exist throughout the world are masks, right? So he was looking at masks. So he would go to the Louvre and he would go, he would travel and all of these things. And he was paying attention on how the ancient civilizations and cultures were looking at the figure. They were the ones, basically, who were simplifying the figure and the form through these very simple shapes. And basically what Picasso did is he looked at that form of identifying beauty from the past and bringing it to the front, to the modern era, right? He was simplifying already the subject matter by creating flat areas, simplified areas. So why redo the wheel when it was already done, and bring those same cultural elements to the past? And if we were discussing, culturally, a conversation between the School of Fine Arts and the modernists, here Picasso is saying, look, I'm also looking at the past, right? Because apparently looking at the past is the right thing to do. So here we go. I'm looking at the past and I'm painting, in the same simplified manner that these cultures did, hundreds, if not thousands years ago. That's why the Mademoiselle d'Avignon, in so many formalistic ways, is such a cool, interesting painting, right? We have this application of beauty from 100 years ago into their face. All kinds of different faces, different cultures in some ways, right? Through the lens of the modernism, the simplification. So tying the past and the present and so forth and so on. So really interesting stuff. Now, it only becomes interesting, I believe, when you can see the connections. When you give yourself the time to learn and to understand these things. If you just flat out look at it without understanding of it, of course it's going to be off-putting. Of course it's going to be awful. Of course it's going to be not pretty. The beauty of all of this comes from understanding what is trying to be done here and what Picasso was trying to achieve. So here gives you an idea. It's a couple of really, classic Picassos. Here we have one, and here we have another one, obviously, and gives you the idea of the size. It's a really large painting. So, Les Mademoiselles d'Avignon. Now, cool thing is that in the same MoMA, well, I don't know, they redid the MoMA, but when I went to New York and I went to the MoMA a few years back, this painting was basically in the same room as Starry Night by Van Gogh. So whenever you guys make it to New York City and you go to the MoMA, you'll be able to see some of these amazing paintings. Now, if you're looking at this painting, right? This painting right here. Would you say this is Picasso or Braque? Picasso or Braque? You know, to the untrained eye, right, you probably couldn't see the difference. You know, however, this one's a Braque painting, and there's a few things I want to point out about Braque, or Cubism in general. One of the things to identify Braque really quickly is the use of words or writing. Picasso eventually will too, however, you will see a lot more writing on Braque's painting, or not writing, that's the wrong word, text in Braque's paintings than you do on Picasso's. The idea behind a good abstract, an abstract that can be considered successful, not good, but successful is a better word, is the recognition of that which is being simplified. Because remember that abstraction works almost like editing a paper. Think of it almost as like a poem with 10 lines that is very simple. How can you get an idea and really squeeze it down to its most basic of elements and you still get it, you still see it, you still recognize those elements? That's how abstraction works. So this kind of elements, a lot of the times abstractions were in some ways more successful than others. And abstraction could be cubistic in all of these other ways. So when you're looking at abstract work, look at it from that lens, that there is just a trial. They're just one attempt to reach the sense of simplification, right? In this case, for example, we have, I believe it's the Portuguese. Yeah. So the Portuguese here, and what elements can you recognize in order to see the subject matter in this case? So we have kind of some kind of a very simplified face here. Sometimes you can see a nose, an eye, maybe a mustache, or the hint of a mouth. Then you have possibly some buttons, right? We might have a shoulder on this side, right? And then we have possibly a guitar or a string instrument. We don't know what it is, right? So that's why I'm being very loose with that. You can also see the other arm here. And it's very simplified. So we know that this individual, right, there's a figure there for sure, playing some instrument, and that's basically what we can see. And obviously there's some other symbology possibly, or other elements there that could give us more information, but at the end, do we really need it, right? At the end, what is a portrait, right? It's just these elements that tells us something about the subject matter. So here we might have just enough information to recognize a Portuguese or this individual. Now, is it successful? Is it not successful? Well, the best way to do is to look at 20, 30 different Braque paintings and possibly Picasso paintings and see if this one compared to another one is more successful than the other one on giving us the reality that has been abstracted. So talk about a very successful abstraction, and I really like this one. Now this is Picasso, and Picasso gives us the collage. We always think of collage being this kind of old way of doing art, and it's like for kids, and you know, it's a kind of looked down upon, things like that. But actually, Picasso is the one who, in some ways, invented, you know, collage as a way of art. Now, the thing that also makes it genius in this case is that he is an abstract artist, right? And abstraction means to get rid of things, you know, to simplify, Well, in this case, the painter has simplified, has abstracted, has taken away so much that the last thing he takes away are his own paints, right? How can a painter paint without paints? Right? How can we still convey through artistic means, through formal means, information, the subject, the figure, all of those things without a paint if you're a painter, right? So here it is. he takes ready-made images, he takes other elements, and then reconstitute them in such a way that the information is still there and he can still convey an idea using all of the means and elements of formal design and so forth and so on. Right? So what are we seeing here? What elements do you see here? Let's see if we can discover what the subject matter of this abstract artwork is. So we have, I normally kind of go from the top to the bottom. We have a bowl, right? Everybody can see a bowl. And if I were to ask you what is inside the bowl, you probably say fruit, and then I'll ask you, how many fruit do you see? Right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fruit. So there's 5 fruit inside that bowl, right? What else is on top of that table? Well, some of you automatically see, because of the contrast, this object here, right? Or this thing right here, which looks like the top of a violin or a guitar. Well, how do we know it might be a violin? Well, this element's right here, normally part of a guitar, plus this kind of simplification, this line right here, right? That's created by that piece of cut paper. Oops. Right? So it gives us a sense of the body of the violin. So we have a violin. So we have violin, we have a bowl with fruit. What else do we have? This is another object here that we have, and we can recognize that in some ways just because of this line and this circle and the fact that it's got these lines right there. That very much could be possibly a drinking glass or a wine glass. Now also we see here a newspaper, a cutout of a newspaper, right? And the word, in the simplified word, journal, which means newspaper in French, right? So we have those elements on top of the table, and then what shape is a table? I would ask you, what shape is a table? So look at that outline right here, and we can say, well, it's a round table, right? And what material would this table be? Then, we have this wood-like pattern on this drawing here that can give us a sense that it's a wood table. And then I say, what is the last thing you see? And the last thing most likely everybody will see is this kind of a simplification visually of what the back of a chair would be. It is not the back of a chair whatsoever, right? It's just this cut out piece of paper with some paint, but that's it. Now, in your mind's eye, can you see a real translation of what this would look like? In other words, can you see in your mind's eye a table with a wood top, with the wine glass, the violin, the fruit inside the bowl that is, the bowl, and the chair in front of it? That is a successful abstract. You have imagery in front of you that have simplified in such a way they can still convey the reality, right? So here's Pablo Picasso, violin, fruit, and wine glass. Now, remember, titles sometimes are directive. It gives you direction of what the information is, and sometimes they're non-directive, meaning they have nothing to do with the imagery that's in front of it. But in this case, a lot of the artworks towards the beginning and middle of modernism, they do have to do quite a bit with the artwork. Towards the end of modernism, we have a lot of untitled or artworks that the titles are not congruent, but we'll get there. So here's another Picasso. Now, he worked in all different kinds of areas. He also worked with ceramics. He worked with, obviously, sculpture, and so forth and so on. Okay, so let's look at another artist from the modern movement. Okay, this artist right here, obviously, is a sculptor. His name is Brancusi. And Brancusi, just like the other artists, are looking at how can we simplify, abstract, edit the information through material to convey the idea. So here we have this figure, this face. My question to you is, does it have to be finished? Does it have to be, well, not finished. Does it have to be polished like a Greek sculpture, right, in order to convey that this is a face? Or can you still recognize it at this point as a face, right? Yes, you can, right? No matter, regardless of whether it is quote-unquote finished, quote-unquote perfect, quote-unquote rendered. All of those things are not important because we can still recognize face. We can still recognize somebody possibly sleeping, possibly dead, um, and none of this other information matter. All right. So what is this object? What are some of his um, muses, or what is he looking at? So he's looking at a few different things, right? And for us, this should be um, recognizable. So the first one is he's looking back, for example, to Rodin. Now Rodin is not, too much older than him, but Rodin is basically part of the story of art history, right? Rodin is the one that sculpturally was understanding or applying Impressionism, right? Capturing the moment without really being tied to this concept of perfectionism of the finish, right? Just allowing yourself to stop the moment that you see the information come across, or what you want to portray across, right? So you can leave all of the different textures that fingerprints and whatever else would give you, right? And also this one right here, right? This is something we've seen before, and this is Michelangelo. Michelangelo. Sorry. So here's Michelangelo, and we have this right here, which is this, once again, Greek, the past. But nevertheless, the information is there. We can see it, but it's not quote unquote complete like you would think is required for it to be, in order for it to say, male figure or anything like that, right? So by looking at both of them, looking at the importance of stopping, right, of just giving enough with the material to convey the information, as well as how can you simplify, edit the information as well in regards to the subject matter. That's sort of the things that Rodin, in so many ways, it's working on. Sorry, Brancusi, not Rodin. So here's one example of Brancusi's head, right? We can recognize this a human head, and then none of, like we mentioned earlier, none of this information. It is important, but it isn't, right? We recognize what it is. Here is the same, similar subject matter, one step further into abstraction and simplification and editing, right? Can you recognize the figure in here, right? We can still recognize the head, very simplified. And if you may, also, it does look almost mask-like. As I mentioned before, all these artists were in constant conversation with each other, so there's no surprise here that it kind of looks a little bit like some of the masks that Picasso was looking at, and even the paintings that Picasso was doing, the simplification of the face. And then eventually we get to this third one right here, and we can still recognize the figure. We can still recognize the face. Now this is a crying infant, right? It's newborn one, but obviously we can see, not obviously, that's the wrong thing, but hopefully we can recognize, face by the mouth, the nose, and that's basically it. Now Brancusi wasn't the only thing. Picasso was not the only thing. Brancusi, one of the things that he loved to do was going to the Louvre in their ancient history section and look at this really ancient artifacts. And one of the artifacts that he was really interested in were this pendant, or this little objects. Now this is, if you're looking through the screen of your computer, that's almost about this right scale, which is probably about 1 inch, 2 inches big. So it's a very, very small object. Now the thing that was really interesting to him was, can you still read face on this thing? Of course you can, right? But the simplified shape here, that ovalistic shape and the triangle in the middle of it, we can still recognize face without the eyes, without the mouth, without the cheeks, without the hair, without all of these elements. Complete simplification and abstraction at its best. So look at the things that he was looking at, right? Not only at his peers, but also at history itself. It's amazing how a lot of people think of modernism as something new, or this idea of simplification and abstraction as something that it's ugly, or because it's new, or because it's the now. And actually, all of those things are very ancient ideas. They're just brought into contemporary times, and specifically during the modern period. That's when we kind of reclaim them from the past. Here's another Brancusi object that's very well known, and this is, before I said the name, before I look at the name, what does it look like? Normally we get two answers. The first one is it looks like a feather, right? And the second one, it looks like a writing pen. The ones you kind of put into ink and then write with. Either or, it has this lure to feather-ish, right? Right. This idea of what a feather might be look like, and it's called bird in space. So bird in space is the kind of a line. It's kind of towards the end of a deconstruction of a subject, right? It's part of a line of three other artworks that gets finally to this point. So this object originally was created, or the subject matter was originally approached in a different way. Here you go. So here have my Astra. So my Astra, as you can see, is a simplified bird. And one of the things I want to mention here in class is, what are the things that makes a bird a bird? Well, a bird has feathers, a bird can fly, and birds have beaks. Those are kind of the three main things that a bird has. So that what makes a bird a bird. So in here we have those kind of three elements, right? Now it cannot fly, obviously. However, he gives us other elements in this case that's bird-like. First of all, he gives a pretty generalistic shape of bird with a tail, right? And then kind of the head and the beak with my Astra. The next iteration of this animal is a lot less animal-like, right? It's much more simplified. Now we do have bird, and this one's called a golden bird, but we do have the beak here, and now we're starting to see the simplification of the body into a much more aerodynamic format. Now, aerodynamics are very important in this time period. Why? Well, because flight is something that's fairly new. This concept of man in flight, all of these elements, and aerodynamics is what made it possible. So in order to attach this kind of rounded object into a symbol of sorts, a visual symbol of the ability for flight, aerodynamics would be wonderful. And therefore, the next iteration is something that's much more aerodynamic, much more soft visually, is going to be bird in space, right? So this iteration, this simplification of the same subject matter. Right now, we have here the aerodynamic shape, as we mentioned. It looks kind of physically like a feather, and then we have the beak. So definitely a bird, right? Now, a lot of times we go into a museum and we see, let's say, for example, this one in the center, right? And then the name of it is Golden Bird, and you kind of see it and you say, oh, that's pretty cool. But the best thing to know is to see this all three side by side. Understand the evolution of the artist. Understand that this is not just something that came out of nowhere. This is a big part of an evolution of an idea, right? You wouldn't have this without this. That's why objects like this sometimes are so expensive, is because when you take time, when you take any understanding of what's happening here, you have to take in consideration the time that it took to make this one, and the time that it took to make that one, and so forth and so on. And without any of this, you don't have that, right? So when you go to an art museum, when you go to a museum, the best times to visit a museum is where you have collections of the same artists together, because you're able to recognize the evolution of the artist. Where do the ideas start? How do they evolve? And what was the conversation in some ways in that artist's minds? What does that art look like? What is the art, the living art look like? Or the evolution of the material, the evolution of the idea, and so forth, right? Each one of these things are just basically snapshots of what the idea is, what the art is. So the art of of simplification, the art of understanding what the subject matter is, and then you just see basically snapshots. These artworks are basically like snapshots of those ideas in evolution. So hopefully you guys, when you go to a museum, you no longer look at just one artwork and judge it by what it is, right? You have to understand there might be a past and a present to that same object in front of you. So here it is. I got to see the actual bird in space in New York City at the MoMA. So once again, maybe you go to New York City, make sure you make it to the MoMA. You'll get to see a lot of the artworks we've seen throughout this this class. So here's bird in space, which gives you also a good sense on dimensions. When I put them side by side here, they almost look the same size, but the reality is that they're not. They're actually very different size. So here's the last one, the one bird in space, but here's also one of the Maestra like objects. Okay, so let's continue moving forward. We had Cubism, yeah, and also now we have Futurism. So we talked a little bit about Futurism in the past. Futurism is artists who are interested on movement. They're seeing things in the 20th century moving a lot faster. We have automobiles, starting to have automobiles. I mean, we have planes, we have trains. Everything's moving much, much faster. However, art itself is still very grounded. Art itself is still very much attached and non-moving. So how can you relay the sense of movement through art? You will see it through lines like Bauhaus, right? Very simple, very sharp, very linear design, so that it gives a sense of movement and direction. But also in this other manner, which is looking at in some way photography, when a subject matter moves through the lens, right? Sometimes it gives a sense of a ghostly sense of movement. Well, we can utilize that in paint to give us a sense of movement. So here we have this painting. Hopefully you're seeing a subject of some sort, either moving up or moving down. You can hopefully recognize a set of stairs, right? So now we have this, whatever it is, moving up or down, a figure. And if you continue to kind of pay attention to the subject in here, or the imagery, then you can start recognizing possibly a leg, a torso of some sort, maybe an arm here, maybe an arm right there as well, a face, hair, or a face here. But nevertheless, it's whatever it is. Like with a photograph, it seems to have moved and been captured, that movement captured from up and down or down to up. Either way, whichever way you see it. Now, when you look at the title, it says new descending staircase. Now, in this case, we know it's moving down. But regardless, even if we didn't have that information, hopefully, the idea of the futurist was to give you a sense of movement, and in this case, you were seeing the movement of this subject either going up or down. Here's another very iconic artwork that deals with futurism or with movement, right? The unique forms of continuity in space. And with futurism, we get to an era of the world, right here at the beginning of the 19th century, right? So about 1920, right? What is this red line? Well, this is World War I. With World War I, in some ways, it fulfills Gauguin's thoughts about Europe and thoughts about what was going on, right? Gauguin was basically feeling like the world in Europe was going in the wrong direction, and this kind of came to be true. And World War I was the kind of all the bad things that were happening in Europe combined at once in some ways. Well, artists were appalled with what was going on at the time period, right? So out of how upset they were with their own peers in Europe, right? artists coalesced in so many ways, like we're coalescing right now with everything that's going on in the world, into a group of artists who were wanting to speak against the world and things that were happening right now. All the doctrines have gotten uh, Europe into that mess. So originally, the Dada movement were a group of artists who wanted to make a presentation, get into a theater and make a presentation. Now, how did they get the name Dada? This is kind of a fable of sorts. A whole bunch of modern artists were sitting down in one of their meetings, and they were trying to figure out a name, and somebody just grabbed a knife and stabbed a dictionary. Then he opened the dictionary with the knife attached to it, and then the tip of the dictionary was right on the tip of the word Dada. And Dada in French kind of means topsy-turvy, upside down, crazy, loony. That's kind of what Dada means. So for them, in general, that name was perfect because it described what was going on with the world. The world wasn't making any sense. So they were going to be making artwork that kind of poked fun at that lack of sense of the world, and kind of show it through artistic means. So that's what Dada is, and Dada is that speaking out, that way of rebelling in some ways using art. So here's one very iconic Dada object, and this is by Duchamp. Duchamp is the same artist that did the futurist painting of the Nude Descending Down the Staircase. And Duchamp was, in some way annoyed. He was definitely part of the Dada movement, and he just felt like art has gotten to a point that it was no longer quote unquote about beauty, and there's all the things that he really disliked about the contemporary way of art, to the point that he basically said that art was dead. So with his dislike of the contemporary world at that time, right, one of the things he decided to do when he was invited to show at a gallery show, he went to the Louvre and grabbed this postcard of the Mona Lisa, one of the most beloved images in the Western world for many, many different things, right? It's the symbol of very much a symbol of the Renaissance, and the Renaissance would just kind of look at, the Greek and the importance of knowledge, and then a connection to, classicism and all the things that kind of awoke in us, and so forth and so on. So the Mona Lisa, in so many different ways, kind of has this power of retaining all that symbology and the iconography within herself. However, he obviously paints a little mustache and, the little goatee, almost like devilish type thing, like the demon and evil, something that's bad. And then he labels it as LHOOQ. LHOOQ is kind of like a mag gab. When you repeat something over and over again, and then you can start hearing something different than what you're saying. So LHOOQ in French basically loosely translated means that she is an ass, right? So you're really putting down this symbol, this image. So is he talking about directly about Da Vinci and the Mona Lisa? Not quite. He's talking about all of the other things that she represents, and that's gotten us, quote unquote, the Western world in at the beginning of the 20th century to the point where we're at, right? So that's where he's making or poking fun at, not so much the Mona Lisa per se, but rather what she stands for. Here's another very iconic object from this time period by the same artist, by Duchamp, and it's called the urinal, the fountain. The fountain. So with the same sense that art is dead, and he was once again invited to another art show, he decided to participate in a kind of interesting way. Obviously, he went to a store, purchased a urinal. He did not even sign it with his own name. He put a pseudonym and then turned it in as the artwork. Now, he's the one that basically in so many ways said that art is dead, right? It's nothing no longer, there's nothing longer available there in art, right? Everything that had to be said has said, and so forth and so on. So, if you were to put this urinal in the gallery, what would you be trying to say? Right? What would be the most simplistic thing to say about putting a urinal as an art object in a museum, in a gallery? Well, what's a urinal used for? To pee on, to release yourself, right? So and in some ways, that is a way of disrespect, right? To release yourself on somebody or on something, right? So by making this artwork be a urinal, which its main purpose is to urinate on, he's literally describing the way he feels about art in so many different ways. One of the things that he didn't realize is that by him taking this object from from the store and bringing it into the gallery, it no longer has the function of a urinal, right? It's not attached to plumbing, it's not attached to water, it's not attached to the wall. So even though it is a urinal, it is no longer a urinal. It changes its meaning. It is now becoming more symbolic. It's much more about the idea, the things that it holds rather than the object it is, right? So in some different way, he created a whole new body of work of art, and a whole new world where artists would be able to dwell in, and this is the ready-made, right? A found object, an object that you take from, that is made with one purpose, and then reinterpreted or taken into the context of the gallery within a completely different set of ideas. So it no longer is the object that it was made for, but something completely different, right? So even though he had decided, or not decided, but he had said in some ways that art was dead, it wasn't really. He actually revitalized it with something completely new, with pure creativity, where the object's not the object, but rather the idea, rather the art. So here's the one in this one's at the Tate in London, and there's several ones around the world, and I want you to understand that they'll be different ones. They look slightly different, and if you ever wanted to, you can actually go buy yourself a porcelain urinal and put art mod in it in 1917, and you have a replica of it, because at the end the object's important, but honestly is what it means that is the art, right? The concepts behind it is really what the art is. So you could have your own Duchamp at home if you wanted to, in some ways. Here's another artwork from this same time period, from the Dada. This is Man Ray. We talked about Man Ray in the past. He's the one that did the rayographs. And this little object is called Cadeau. Right? Cadeau is very whimsy, very, very much an object from this time period, which is crazy. I mean, what would you gift? Because that's what cadeau means. Gift this object, right? Is it usable, right? It is not usable, right? You cannot use it as an iron. You cannot use the nails. One of the things that I like to recognize in this object, besides its silliness as an object, it also kind of the underlying social commentary, I believe, exists with this object, right? So we have this object that is an every use object that is fairly essential, right? Especially for society. You get suits, you got all these things that are needed for business and politics and whatever else. So the iron kind of in some ways represents the availability, and as well as in some ways kind of that world. And then you have nails or screws, which are meant to build, right? They're meant to construct, create something. And then you have these two objects simply found every day that are meant to be productive, that together are not. Actually, they could be destructive. You know, they could be more of a weapon of sorts, or in order to destroy. So if we were to kind of overlay some of the silliness of this object with the seriousness of World War One, we can see some elements related to society, maybe politics, governments, something that we need, things that are basically used every day, and as well as are meant to grow and build, but then, you know, together, used in a proper way, they can also be a weapon, a form of destruction. So pretty cool. I love this object quite a bit. And once again, you can recreate yourself another one. Look, if you notice this one, which is the image that's found online, you know, versus this one right here at the Tate, you see how much different they are. So two different irons, and then some screws. And the cool thing is, you know, you can recreate this object if you wanted to. Once again, it's more about the idea than anything else. Okay, and then thing on after this one, we're going to stop. So here we have Hannah Hawk. And Hannah Hawk is a poet, and she created these collages in order to poke fun of a lot of different things. So unfortunately, this kind of imagery gets lost for us unless we really understand the era of World War I. There's a whole bunch of imagery here, symbology that together pokes fun at some of the information in there. One of the things that I want to get a point across is that that's what it's trying to accomplish, right? To be satirical. Now, a lot of you guys and a lot of us actually watch television nowadays, and we look at the Today Show or one of those night shows where, you know, comics are the ones who kind of relay the news in a comical, kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of way, kind of poking fun, but at the same time being very serious. This is the great-grandfather artistically of those kind of shows. This is satire at its very beginning, where you have an art form poking fun, but at the same time being serious about the subject matter that is, you know, conveying. So Hannah Hawk and this beautiful collages. All right, so what I'm going to do is going to stop right here. You guys have seen this artwork before, right? This is not a pipe. And we will continue on next time. Thank you, guys.